Hello and welcome to all the men and women of the West. I'm Joe. Hello and welcome to the 12 Great Men of Arda podcast. This is the second episode in this series all about retelling the lives of 12 great men of John Ronald Reuel Tolkien's fictional universe in history podcast format. The inherent idea is to recount the lives of 12 great men from their births to their deaths. So here we go. The first episode was about Turin to Rambar, with a semi-follow-up episode having swiftly followed about his cousin Tuor. This episode, though, will be all about Elrond's twin brother, Elros, son of Eärendil and Elwing. A quick note for those who have been patiently awaiting this episode. I didn't make it sooner, both due to how much time and energy it takes to produce these sorts of episodes, and I've been busy with my own projects and school. And I made the personal vow that I wouldn't rush all these videos out and would wait till the channel got up to 500 subs. The next episode will be published once the 1,000 subs goal is met. So you want to see the next episode? Smash that subscribe button and share this video. Now without further ado, let's begin properly. The second truly great man in Tolkien's universe, most of the info about him is to be taken from books such as The History of Middle-earth, The Unfinished Tales, Nature of Middle-earth, the appendixes of Lord of the Rings, and the Silmarillion. So there isn't all that much to go on. That said, what is necessary to do is paint a kind of word picture about the world and the events that led both to and shaped the birth and childhood of this great man and his incredible brother Elrond, as their tales are rather interconnected. After the fall of Gondolin, Tuor and Idril fled south, taking with them the greatest treasure of Gondolin, Eärendil. Destined to be the greatest of the warriors of the House of Fingolfin, he was destined for greatness from the word go. Now you may well be wondering, what about Elwing? Well, for that part of this story, we have to go back a little. You see, in the Battle of Sudden Flame, that saw the first banjo solo and appearance of that showboat Glaurung, there was a human who died in this battle, one by the name of Barahir. Barahir was notable for having been besties with Finrod Felagund, kind of the Ned Flanders of the elves, who was friendly with just about everyone. Barahir, though, was given an emerald-jeweled ring by the Timon to his Pumbaa, except there was plenty of worries ahead for the line of Barahir, as he was to die in that said battle. His son Beren fled south, past spider-infested lands. He eventually landed himself in Doriath, where he was to end up peeping on the king's daughter as she was dancing and strutting her stuff. Now Luthien is quite possibly the most special individual in all of the Legendarium. She had all the power of her mom, Melian, had Thingol, king of the Sindarin Wood Elves, for a dad, and was apparently drop-dead gorgeous beyond belief. So, essentially, she had the looks of Alexandra Tidings in the 90s, and was a Luke Skywalker, or Anakin Skywalker in some ways, of fantasy, in that she was the chosen one. And boy, did she ever prove it. I won't go into every detail of their quest, as that could be an entire couple of dozen videos, if not hundreds. Luthien strutted her stuff, dancing around, and Beren, being a guy with a pulse, at once fell in love and gave her nickname, Tenuviel. He then agreed, like any incel might, to go fetch a shiny rock from Morgoth's helm after her dad said no, he couldn't marry her and had to do this first. Going south first to get his dad's bestie, whom he became besties with too, he soon went north, and after a stay in the hotel otherwise known as Sauron's prison cells, was rescued by his girlfriend and her new pet dog, Huan, whom she had, quote-unquote, stolen from the Feanorians. She more or less set him free from them. They then busted into Angband. She danced in front of Morgoth. He fell asleep, and they tore out a Silmaril from his crown. As to him falling asleep, while the most beautiful woman in all of literature dances in front of him, make of that what you will, and do please judge him. A lot. Beren and Luthien then fled from the castle, only for a wolf demon Karkaroth to give chase after them. Deciding that the heroic Beren's hand looked mighty tasty, he took out his handkerchief, tied it about his neck, and proceeded to politely munch down on Beren's hand, which also had a rock held in it. I hope he used the correct condiment, because he's in for quite the indigestion. Apparently, Silmarils are a spicy meatball, as this one was so spicy it drove Karkaroth cuckoo, much as Cocoa Puffs might otherwise have done. Later, Beren and Huan were to die on the hunt for Karkaroth, that they went on with Luthien's dad, Thingol. Killing the beast and gutting it They stuffed it and hung Cockroft over their fireplace. Either that or the elves gave him to Dion for him to have as a stuffed animal later. Beren, though, didn't stay dead and was later revived after Luthien went to complain to Mandos, who was so moved by her haunting song, he gave her Beren back. Beren and Luthien lived happily ever after, for the most part living out one of the few truly happy lives in the Legendarium. Now, as you all know, Beren's cousin didn't have much of a great life himself, as Turin, who was also a kind of brother to Luthien by way of fosterage, died under rather tragic circumstances. His death affected Thingol so badly he decided to meld the Silmaril with the Nauglamir with some dwarvish assistance, this Nauglamir being that necklace that Hurin tossed his way. In the last episode, I went over how Thingol died to those dwarves below Menegroth. Yeah, recap over. Let's move to what happened next. Dwarves raided the place. Beren fought to retrieve this silmarillion. I know it doesn't sound right. I made that word up. Shut up. I know I suck at linguistic making. But this is my podcast and I'll do what I want. Beren got it back, pushed out the dwarves from Doriath, and gave it to his beloved wife who wore it before she eventually died herself. It was then that Luthien made her biggest mistake. She gave the necklace and her crown to her idiot son, Dion. If you want to estimate the depths of Dion's stupidity, let's just put it this way. Turgon had nothing on this buffoon. Where Turgon ignored the evidence in front of him, Dion did that and more. The son of Beren and Luthien, he must have heard of how nuts the Feanorians were for their precious shiny rocks, so that his decision to taunt them and rub it in their faces when they sent a messenger asking for their rock is really incomprehensible. Naturally, Maedhros and his brothers did the only thing any reasonable guys might do. They raided the place, slaughtered the royal family, and destroyed Menegroth, razing it to the ground and almost all of Doriath. Whoops. Elwing, of course, escaped with some of the Sindarin. It was her escape as a young maid that allowed her to meet the love of her life, Eärendil, who was by this time in the south. Sindarin and Noldorin at this time intermingled, and after Tuor and Idril went boating with the express goal of never returning, Eärendil was to inherit the position of being these elves' leader. Though he wasn't the idiot that Dion was, Eärendil wasn't exactly winning any awards for Dad of the Year. Sure, he did the universe a favor by knocking up Elwing and thus fathering Elrond and Elros, but one of the first things he did was go boating himself because he missed his daddy. Okay, so maybe he had some separation issues, worse than my dog Jets. On one of his trips, Maedhros and his brothers raided the hidden home of these elves and proceeded to do what they did before. They performed the final of the elvish kinslaying wars. Geez, you leave your remaining 6 kids and they go and commit genocide, not once but thrice. I wonder if maybe the next time the Feanorians feel the urge to commit kinslaying and genocide, they might not otherwise consider taking a stick of gum instead. Anyways, Elwing escaped by jumping off a cliff with the Silmaril, only to be caught by Ulmo, who then turned her into a dove and had her borne off after Eärendil. Yes, you heard that correctly. He turned Elwing into a bird. At this point, I can't help but feel for the Feanorians. All this drama and murder for a shiny rock, and she pulls a cheating move like that out of her hat? Anyways, while she thought her kids were already dead and was racing off with her husband westwards to help beg for help from the Valar and the elves still living in Valinor, Elrond and Elros were left to the tender mercies, if inadvertently so, of the Feanorians. It has to be recognized that though they had committed countless atrocities, Maedhros and Maglor had gone into Middle-earth with the best of intentions. In the Battle of the Unnumbered Tears, they had formed a league of sorts to fight Morgoth, and had failed. This failure had broken them, especially Maedhros, as he had lost his best friend and cousin Fingon, and had become disgraced in the eye of all. Likely pressured and all but enslaved by his younger brothers, he was made to lead their slaughters, with the tallest of all elves, likely by this time, exhausted emotionally and in spirit. Maglor, at the sight of the defenseless twin sons of Eärendil, was moved to pity and begged for their lives. Maedhros didn't take much persuasion and readily agreed to raise them. While Eärendil was busy elsewhere, it has to be noted that Maedhros and Maglor took up a kind of foster fathers and foster sons relationship with the twins, in what was akin to Piccolo's bond with Gohan from DBZ, though far less heartwarming in some ways. Likely these opening years were formative in nature, and likely, though they did come to appreciate their two elder kinsmen, neither Elros nor Elrond could have forgotten how they came to be fostered by these two. But while they were growing up, away from the violence, in what was the first peaceful period of their lives, the Valar were on the march. The war that ensued became known as the War of Wrath, an almost 40-year conflict that signaled the end of the First Age, and of Morgoth's reign as Dark Lord of Arda. It has to be noted that the most accomplished warrior in the war was, of course, Eärendil, who on Vingalot destroyed Angalagan the Black, the greatest dragon ever, and throwing him down with a single blow upon Thangorodrim, which broke beneath the gargantuan dragon. After the war, the Silmarils of Morgoth were retrieved and presented to Maethras and Maglor, who were tested only for them to fail when they seized the gems. The former was distraught by the burning of his flesh that signaled the truth of his corruption and the rejection by the Holy Rock, and did what any rational individual might do, threw himself into a volcano. As to Maglor, he chucked it into the sea, only to spend the rest of his days crying about it. As they would have said in my day, sissy. As to Elros and Elrond, they, according to the latter in the Lord of the Rings, had gone off to fight in the War of Wrath, fighting and distinguishing themselves in the conflict that followed. Likely traumatized by the war, as it was one of the most violent in the history of Middle-earth, though in Elrond's case, likely the War of the Last Alliance was worst. Regardless, it was to the end of this war that the half-elves were presented with the choice of their parents, to go all human or all elf. Elros chose to become a man, and Elrond an elf, in that order, the two choosing to follow their hearts respectively. As to those Edain who had fought alongside them against Morgoth in the War of Wrath, they and Elros were asked by the Valar what it was they desired most. Most men declared that they wanted two things: peace and a long life to enjoy that peace. The former was promised, to the relief of Elros, and the latter, well, that needed a bit of work. Consulting with Eru, who said, sure, why not? Let them have something, I guess. The Valar and Eru made a star-shaped island named Numenor, or Atalante. It was far away from the shores of Middle-earth, out in the ocean between it and the western continent of Aman, or Valinor, as it is also called. Being near to the blessed land granted extended life, and with Elros being half-elven, the descendants of these men didn't need to take massive super steroids like Steve Rogers or Deathstroke to become semi-superhuman. Let that be a lesson to you kids. Be good, fight on crusades against the devil for the gods, and ask for an extended life and perks rather than doing drugs. Naturally, there were two problems that folks faced after the War of Wrath. One was that Beleriand, the OG continent, had sunk beneath the waves during the war. Oops. And thus, everyone was displaced and without a home. The other was actually getting to this promised land. While a great many elves left west to go to Aman, being tired of Arda, who could blame them, Elros began the process of boat building, getting them insured, and rallying what men he could to start on the Great Voyage. The process of colonizing the uninhabited island took many decades. It was near the beginning of this process that he likely founded what was initially little more than a town and later to become one of the greatest cities in all of Arda, Armenelos the Golden. This city was to be as Rome or Constantinople were to the people of antiquity and the medieval ages. Elros, though, by the time he had begun to transport less and less people and spend more and more time on the island, which these people had requested, was by this time old by the standards of ordinary men, such as you or I. He was 90 years old. Tall and regal, he was incomparable to us, though, and had more in common with the elves he had grown up with, and with whom he held still a close-knit bond with, especially his twin brother, Elrond. Thus it was that Elros was nominated by the men of the newly christened island of Numenor king. His kingship was to be a long one, where he set the island's affairs in order, built the city up, established the laws, and added continuously to this city, and kept strong ties with the mainland, with those such as Gil-galad, Galadriel, and as stated, his beloved brother, Elrond. It was likely shortly before or after his coronation that Elros fell in love with a woman. Not much is known, and it's not that important, as the end result was of far greater importance to the tale. He fathered 4 children, all of whom would grow up to be of assistance to their wise father. They were Vardamir, Noliman, and then there was Manwendil, and then Antanelkar, and Elros' only daughter, Tindomiel. It was also Elros who received the lion's share of the inheritance over his brother Elrond, as it was Elros, or Tar-Minyatar, as many now called him, the first High Ruler, as he inherited Aranruth, the Sword of Thingol, the Ring of Barahir, the Dramborleg, that is to say the Axe of Tuor, all of which would become Numenorian heirlooms. As he had chosen to count his lot amongst those of men, it is likely, with increasing consternation over the centuries, that the elves noticed that their former kindred was growing old. Yet to those who were men, there were entire generations that passed with no other king save this incredibly long-lived monarch. In total, Elros reigned for 410 years, living to the spectacular age of 500 years. Not very long for the elves, but incredible length for mortal men doomed to die. Tar-Minyatar, when the end came, incredibly for the later greedy people of Numenor, relinquished his life gladly and died in his bed, wizened, wise, and happy. Beloved by his people and by his brother Elrond, he was missed, though the latter in time overcame the loss of his brother, and even found another brotherly spirit of sorts in Gil-galad, and a wife in Celebrian, the fair daughter of Galadriel. Numenor, though, never quite forgot their first king, or forgave him. As to Vardamir, Elros' heir, also old by the time his father had perished, he had likely acted as deputy, herald, and all but co-monarch, alongside his father for a lengthy period of time. He, however, had declined the throne. Feeling himself too old, and likely wishing to relinquish his life, as his father had done, he lasted another few years, but lived peacefully in obscurity. He likely got one of the better end of the deals in terms of life in all of Arda's history. His own heir, Tar-Amandel, went on to reign from after the death of Elros until 590 of the Second Age, when he too handed over the scepter to his own son, only to die in 603, in the same manner as his father's. It was thus getting to be customary for these kings to abdicate, retire, and die peacefully. The trouble was that, as the generations passed, they grew further from their distant and wise uncle Elrond, turning away from him and his brother's example. What also became lost to them was the reason for Elros Tar-Minyatar's decision to die rather than retain the supposed elvish immortality. Tar-Elendil and his children were the last, or near to the last, to have understood the wisdom of Elros. Tar-Elendil would be the king who acknowledged the rights of his daughters to the throne, setting up Silmarillion in a way so that her right to pass a claim to the throne was established, and thus her sons were put in the line of succession. Her brother Tar-Meneldur, though, would acknowledge this and remain close to her. She was, however, to wed the Lord of Undunye and was given the Ring of Barahir, along with other parts of the inheritance. It was in the reign of Meneldur, though, that things began to go badly. For one thing, Meneldur was the first king to spoil his children rotten. He early on developed the habit of, when his son Eldarion would throw a hissy fit, hurry over to concede everything and give way completely. This pattern was to have deadly consequences for the history of Middle-earth. As Eldarion was, to put it lightly, not a very likable guy. Eldarion's requests, though, were at first innocent enough. He wanted to go boating with his maternal grandpa. Despite his worry for the boy, Meneldur agreed. This Eldarion did. Then in time, as he came of age, he asked for his own boat. Okay, sure. Then he asked to be allowed to go off to Middle-earth. Okay, but Meneldur the king, who loved astronomy, could not detect in the stars or in his son's increasingly distant behavior towards Numenor what his son might do next. Now in time, Eldarion's mom, the queen, began to grow itchy for grandchildren and push forward a young noble girl who was equally stubborn as Eldarion to go on to love her son. This woman was horrendous. Eldarion, though, was busy with his toys and establishing ports and Numenorian dominance and soft power throughout Middle-earth, refusing to explain his reasoning or what he was up to his parents, or why he was chopping more trees than ever before on Numenor. Meneldur attempted to at last rein his son in. Unused to discipline, Eldarion became increasingly erratic and continued running off on adventures and would argue/fight bitterly with poor old Meneldur. In time, though, he did stay long enough to wed Arendis and father a daughter. So he's staying at home this time, right? No more crazy Sinbad-styled adventures or imperialist flights of fancies. Oh no, he's gone again. Treating his wife like she's a one-night stand. What a charmer. Honestly, Turin was less of an idiot, and far less erratic than this buffoon. The trouble was that, while he did do right by establishing good relations with the elves, and colonies and ties with Middle-earth, Eldarion suffered from an overrated and overweening opinion of himself. Hated his dad, and was easily the most arrogant king of Numenor until the rise of Kiryatan. He was insufferable, and fancied that the ports and ships were always in disrepair if he wasn't around, and demanded that in spite of his long absences, he be treated as a returning triumphant emperor by his people, by his kin, and most of all by his wife, who just wanted a husband, even if only for a short time. It happened that one time when he came home, his wife put him in another room in her countryside home. Unimpressed, he had her wake up on Kalime, humiliated Arendis, all to express his dominance, and introduced himself at long last to his daughter, who had not known who he was. Then disappeared, leaving his fuming wife broken and embarrassed, and his daughter with the knowledge that her mother was not all-powerful, and that she was to be shunned and disregarded for being amongst those common men or women who aged. Yes, I'm being harsh with him, but this lesson was not lost on Kalime, and he, rather than resolve his differences with Arendis quietly, he did so always in front of his daughter, so that she knew where the power lay and how to combat her mother's disciplining hand. On his next stop over in Numenor, Eldarion was accosted by his weary father, who was sick in spirit and flashing a letter from Gil-galad that heaped endless praise and worship upon Eldarion for being the newly risen Eru Ilúvatar, for being as good as Eärendil, and whatnot. Nah, I'm pulling your leg. But the amount of worship in the letter could lead one to speculate whether it really was written by Gil-galad, or whether it was a ploy by Eldarion to finally crush what little resistance his interfering father had begun to put up again against his shipbuilding and sailing missions. Without a doubt, the elves had come to appreciate the Numenorians. But let's be honest, Eldarion was as far away from Elros as one could get in personality. One was humble, the other a cocky, self-absorbed prick. One who shouted and often humiliated his father, sisters, mother, and wife, while the other, the ancestor, had loved them all, had done all he could for them all. Regardless your opinion of Eldarion, we can all agree there is some sort of difference in temperament and vision for Numenor between these two men. Eldarion, though, was to, with this letter, not only crush his father politically, but in terms of spirit. Menelder submitted at last to his son, to the boy's immense satisfaction, and even agreed to write a letter to Kalime and Arendis, scolding them and commanding them to come submit and kneel before Eldarion. It didn't exactly go as planned. The goal was to humiliate and reconcile, if this term could be truly used with Arendis, but she wouldn't meet with Eldarion. She was sick of the guy, and honestly was tired of fighting, so preferred to just send on Kalime. Eldarion was to remark that he was disappointed in Arendis, and that he had expected more, that he would have preferred it had she come, commanding and bossy, and full of her own bluster and right to the throne as his queen. But in reality, had she, he would have humiliated and destroyed her in front of the court. They knew it, he knew it, and Arendis knew it. Arendis, though, had chosen to submit quietly, if slightly more gracefully. She had acknowledged his supremacy and had agreed to a countryside exile as a broken woman. The point was made. His daughters spent the rest of Arendis' life worsening the pain of her mother by playing father and mother against one another, until at last Arendis left for the sea to chase after Eldarion, only to die at sea. Given her advanced age and how broken she is, it is possible that she committed suicide, just as it is possible that she perished of old age. It is a sad fact that, where Elros and his immediate heirs had chosen humility to trade peacefully with the continent, to never quarrel with one another, and to honor their ancestors, Eldarion chose to tear the scepter from his father's hands, and chose to clash bitterly with his own wife, and to subdue her completely and entirely until she was little more than a weeping, pleading, broken woman, as though she were an enemy. Regardless the opinion one might have of him, or of his father's poor parenting, none can deny one important clue to the underlying nature of this reign. It was during Eldarion's term in office that not only had Numenor gotten a taste of imperialism, but also that the first clashes within the royal family had taken place, and most of all, the first hints that on the continent the shadow had awoken, and that it would be the future of Numenor, despite the bright start by Elros Tar-Minyatar, was to only grow darker in the generations to come. The kings, more apart from Middle-earth, as Aldarion did have one good trait. He was always in the thicket of the trouble, getting his own hands dirty, so that he would, in some ways, be the last for a long time to actually get involved in the continent's affairs. Now, if you enjoyed this video and have tolerated my jokes and poor opinion of Tar Aldarion, and feel I deserve some small reward, similar to Elros Tar-Minyatar's, I do hope you leave a comment and that you remember to smash that subscribe button, as though you were Sauron the Shadow seeking to destroy his enemy, the noble High King of the Elves, Gil-galad.